Alright, hi everyone. Welcome to this video where we'll be exploring the functions of insulin as well as glucagon and how they can actually affect the blood glucose concentration. Before we get started, let's take a look at a short clip to sort of give us an overview about the effects of these two hormones, and then we'll focus on them individually.
In this video, we're going to explore how our blood glucose concentration is controlled by the hormones insulin and glucagon. And at the end, we'll see how these fit together in a negative feedback loop. Blood glucose concentration is just a fancy way of describing the amount of sugar in our bloodstream. We all need a decent amount of sugar in our blood, so that our cells have a constant supply of glucose that they can use for respiration. However, if the blood glucose concentration gets too high, it can start to damage our tissues. So we need to keep a fine balance, where it's not too high or too low. If you were to eat a really big meal that had loads of carbohydrates in it, then those carbohydrates would be broken down in your intestines into lots of glucose molecules. These would then be absorbed into your bloodstream and cause your blood glucose concentration to increase. We can see this if we plot on a graph that measures how blood glucose concentration changes with time. Before the meal, the level of glucose fluctuates slightly but stays around this normal level. Once we eat the carbohydrates though, we see this spike as the glucose is absorbed into the blood. This rise in glucose levels will be detected by your pancreas, which is an organ that sits just behind the stomach, and in response, it will release a hormone called insulin into your bloodstream. As it's travelling around the body, the insulin will bind to receptors on certain cells, which tells those cells to take in some of the glucose that's floating around in your blood. This happens in loads of different cells, but most important are liver and muscle cells. These two take up lots of the extra glucose molecules and combine them together to form glycogen, which is basically a long-term storage form of glucose. And so because all of this glucose is being removed from the blood glucose concentration is going to decrease. Looking back at our graph, we can see this as the glucose concentration falling back to the normal level. So we now know how our body fixes high levels of glucose, but we also need to be able to fix low levels of glucose. And this is where glucagon comes in. Don't get glucagon confused with glycogen. Glucagon is a hormone, whereas glycogen is a large molecule made up of lots of glucose molecules. Just like insulin, glucagon is also released from the pancreas, but it actually does the opposite of insulin, which is to say that it increases blood glucose rather than decreases it. So if we were to look at our graph again, and imagine that our blood glucose levels drop too low, for example because we skipped our breakfast and have been rushing about all morning, then our pancreas would detect this low concentration of blood glucose and secrete glucagon into the bloodstream. As the glucagon travels around the body, it would bind to lots of different cells, but mainly liver cells, which will take that glycogen that we mentioned earlier and break it down into lots of glucose molecules again. And then it would release these glucose molecules into the blood. This would bring the blood glucose concentration back up to normal, so that all of our cells have a good supply of it for respiration. If you think about insulin and glucagon together, you can see that they create a negative feedback loop. If glucose levels get too high, then insulin is released, which causes the glucose to drop down again. But if it drops too low, then glucagon is released, which causes the glucose levels to increase again. In reality, our bodies keep releasing insulin and glucagon to ensure that the amount of glucose in our bloodstream is always kept around the right levels. And this is why our blood glucose concentration constantly changes or fluctuates like this, rather than being a flat line. So we hope you found that useful. If you did, then please do give us a like, and we'll see you next time.
Alright, as you can see from the video itself, right, these two hormones actually have a lot of different varied effects on different target cells, right? And that's what we learn about hormones. Hormones can affect multiple target cells at once. So let's zoom in and take a look at them one by one. Firstly, with regards to the overview. So both insulin and glucagon, as we mentioned in the video just now, are produced by the islets of Langerhans of the pancreas. Now this is what we learned before, earlier before this particular concept. These are what is known as endocrine glands, right? So all hormones are produced by endocrine glands, and the islets of Langerhans are the endocrine glands within the pancreas. So insulins, what they do is that they help to decrease the blood glucose concentration, whereas glucagon helps to increase the blood glucose concentration. Right? And one of the target organ that they work on is actually the liver. Right? So they can actually result in a conversion of excess glucose to glycogen in the liver, or conversion of glycogen back into glucose in the liver. So let us look at insulin first. Now, insulin, the purpose is to actually decrease blood glucose concentration. So what we must ask ourselves is, when will insulin be released out from the islets of Langerhans? Now, it must be when the blood glucose concentration is too high, right, higher than normal, and there's a need for you to decrease it back to where it is. So what insulin does is that it actually increases the rate of glucose uptake by cells by making the plasma membranes more permeable to glucose. Now what this means is that, right, if you look at a cell, okay, let's say this is just a simple model of a cell with a nucleus inside, and we know that there's a plasma membrane. Now we know that plasma membrane are what we call partially permeable membrane, which means that it allows certain substances to go in and out, but not others, right? So let's say that in this context, right, the glucose are supposed to enter into the cell for, say, respiration, be used by the mitochondrion for respiration, right? So what insulin does, right, is actually it opens up even more entry points for the glucose, okay, which is represented by over here, cellular glucose. Let's say that the surrounding of the cell is the blood, okay? This is the bloodstream. Now the bloodstream has a lot of glucose as represented over here. All these hexagon shape that's in blue are the glucose in the blood. And now what it means that with all these tiny channels, right, it's a lot easier and a lot faster for all this glucose to diffuse into the cell, right? And that's how it allows the glucose uptake to increase. And as a result, there will be lesser glucose in the blood already, right? And that's how it decreases the blood glucose concentration. Let's take a look at simulation to see how will this look like in a 3D animation.
Glucose enters the cell through a process called facilitated diffusion.
Right, as you can see from the video, there's one of the effects of insulin and how it helps to decrease the blood glucose concentration. Now, insulin also affects another target organ, like what I mentioned, which is the liver. Now, what insulin does is that it actually stimulates the liver and muscle cells to convert glucose into glycogen for storage. Now, what this means is that any form of glucose that was initially in the bloodstream, right, will actually be converted into glycogen for storage inside the liver as well as the muscle cells. As a result, the overall blood glucose concentration decreases. At the same time, insulin can also increase the rate of oxidation of glucose during tissue respiration. Now, as you recall, we have learned this before, that in respiration, right, let's take for instance aerobic respiration, right, glucose actually reacts with oxygen to provide us with a few possible products such as carbon dioxide, water, and a large amount of energy, right? So that's why we learned in the respiration chapter. So what this means is that with the help of insulin, right, this entire process, right, will actually become a lot faster. The rate will become a lot faster, and as a result, you have to use up more and more glucose. And this helps to decrease the overall blood glucose concentration. Now, just to give you a bit more information, these are additional information, so you might not find it in your notes, okay? Now, what happens if insulin are over-secreted? Now, it is possible sometimes for certain people to have over-secretion of hormones. In this case, if you have too much insulin, what will happen? Now, we need to ask ourselves, what is the purpose of insulin? Insulin decreases the blood glucose concentration. So if too much of it comes out, right, it will actually result in abnormally low blood glucose concentration. So that's when your blood glucose concentration will drop too drastically. As a result, you might develop symptoms such as hunger, rapid heartbeat, as well as irritability. And in severe cases, you might lapse into a coma or even die. Now, what happens if insulins are under-secreted? That means you need insulin, but your body is not producing enough. Okay, so as you can imagine, this will mean that you will always have an abnormally high blood glucose concentration, right? So your blood glucose concentration will always stay too high because you don't have enough insulin to help lower it down. At the same time, it also means that your tissue cells cannot fully utilize or store any form of glucose, and you end up having symptoms such as a weak body, continual weight loss, as well as you have glucose that's present within your urine. And this is actually what we known as diabetes, right? So you know that in recent years, the government has been rolling out a lot of health campaigns with a health promotion board to advocate for a low sugar diet, because diabetes rate is on a very steep rise within Singapore, right? So this actually is a main health issue that Singaporeans face. So what exactly is diabetes? There's actually two types of diabetes, alright? So there's type 1. Type 1 diabetes is actually due to a person not having enough insulin production. So it can be inherited from the parents, right? So naturally they will not have enough insulin. As a result, it's very hard for them to lower down their blood glucose concentration. For type 2 diabetes is when insulin is still being produced in sufficient amount, however, the target cells do not respond that well. What this means is that, right, if you recall, insulin is supposed to affect certain cells, but now these cells are not cooperating with insulin. So whatever insulin wants to do to lower the blood glucose concentration, it no longer happens. Now for these people, right, taking insulin jabs or injections of these hormones into their body will not help, because it is not them not having enough insulin, but rather their body is unable to respond to the effects of insulin, right? So what they must do is to actually control their diet and to make sure they exercise regularly enough so that they can lower down their blood glucose concentration. Now, in terms of glucagon, what are the effects of glucagon? We all know that glucagon does the opposite of insulin. That means its job is to actually increase the blood glucose concentration rather than decrease it. So imagine that you are starving, you are very hungry, or you are fasting, right? For the Muslim students, this would mean that your blood glucose concentration will naturally fall very, very low. But in order to prevent your body from going into a state of coma, or from causing you to lose consciousness or feel very dizzy, right? Your body will actually naturally have glucagon being produced to help to increase back the blood glucose concentration. So glucagon actually helps to increase blood glucose concentration, and this is in response to a situation whereby your blood glucose concentration is too low. Then glucagon will be released by the islets of Langerhans to help to raise back the blood glucose concentration. One way that it does so is that it stimulates the liver and muscle to convert glycogen into glucose. This is the opposite of what insulin is doing. Secondly, it also stimulates the conversion of fats as well as amino acids into glucose. So it helps your body to generate more glucose so that it can enter the blood and be used for the various respiration within the body, so that you can get energy to last through the whole day, right? It can also stimulate the conversion of lactic acid into glucose. So that is all that is about insulin as well as glucagon. As you can see, these two hormones are actually very, very crucial to ensure that we are able to function, because they help to ensure that we have the normal blood glucose concentration that keeps us stable, right? So it cannot be in a situation whereby, let's say today you drink a cup of Coke, right? Then you end up getting a high blood glucose concentration forever, right? Then it will affect you in a lot of ways. So what happens is that if you take in sweet drinks, your body will naturally detect the sharp increase in blood glucose concentration, and insulin will be released out to help to lower it back to normal state, right? Likewise, if you are very, very hungry, your blood glucose concentration will decrease, your body will detect it, and your islets of Langerhans will release glucagon that helps to increase back the blood glucose concentration, right? So in order to help you register what are the differences between these two hormones, it's important for you to make use of the paper that's given to you to actually construct a comparison table to help you sort of classify the information that you have learned, right? This will help you to better remember what exactly is different about these two hormones and what they do. Of course, at the same time, you can always look at it in terms of a comparison of the functions as well as the final effects of two hormones. So there's really a few ways for you to practice and to sharpen your understanding of these two hormones. One way is through this. Alternatively, you can also attempt the practice questions that you see over here that requires you to provide structured answers, structured responses to the questions, right? So there's a total of a few questions that you can attempt over here. With that, we have come to the end of this video that's on the hormone of insulin as well as glucagon. Thank you.